We're always telling your stories, and it's time someone tells ours. We're humans first, journalists second. We chose this career to give you a voice. Now we're voicing ours. It's true, journalism has much room for improvement, but not all hope is lost, and we want your trust back by humanizing one journalist at a time. We're sharing with you what we go through to bring you the news. The pain, the tears, the trauma, and the mental health struggles. It's painful, and sometimes we even work 2 jobs to make ends meet. But we all have something in common. The passion, the joy, and the love we feel for storytelling and holding the powerful accountable. That includes holding ourselves accountable. So here are stories from us. This is how we want to help improve the news industry. The Awakened Journalist is proud to present Media Healers by Emiliana Molina Fajardo. Hi everyone, welcome back to The Awakened Journalist and our 3rd season of Media Healers. Today we'll be speaking with Sarah French. She's a 3-time Emmy Award winning journalist who's been in the news industry for almost 15 years. She's a broadcast news anchor for the NBC affiliate WCNC Charlotte in market size 22, according to the Nielsen DMA rankings. She previously worked at WHDH in Boston, Massachusetts as a morning anchor, and she was on the ground covering the Boston Marathon bombing. She also worked at WTIC in Hartford, Connecticut, where she had to cover the tragic death of her friend and colleague, Alice Morrin, due to domestic violence. And after Alice's death, Sarah worked side by side with Connecticut legislators to pass a 9/11 texting bill to honor her life and offer more tools and support to domestic violence victims. Sarah is a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism, and in 2021, she went back to school and earned her Master of Journalism degree. And after covering the Boston Marathon bombing, Sarah decided that her research would focus on how to help journalists who cover traumatic events, and she's been doing exactly that. So Sarah, welcome and thank you for agreeing to speak with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be here.
Wonderful. Sarah, so before we get into all your experience and detailed research and everything you're doing for journalists right now, how did you first decide to become a journalist?
So I've always loved storytelling, and I feel like everyone has a story, as cheesy as that sounds, but I just got in it for storytelling. People go into journalism for all different reasons. Sometimes they're passionate about sports or politics. And for me, it was just finding that story. And to this day, being able to just sit down with someone and have them open up to me and share their story, it's what brings me back day after day.
Wonderful. And I think, from speaking to you over the phone, you've had wonderful, amazing experiences throughout your career. 15 years in the news industry is no joke. And, along with the wonderful memories and stories that you've told, you've also faced very difficult times, especially when you were in Connecticut. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you faced during that news station and covering your friend and colleague's death?
Yeah, I always tell people when you go into journalism, you're meeting people on their best day or their worst day. And so for me, when that experience happened in Hartford, it really taught me that every story we cover is someone's mom, dad, sister, or best friend. And I really had a shift as a journalist in how I read stories on air when I'm anchoring, how I ask victims to do an interview if they would like to share their story, how I am when I sit down with them. And when I edit a story, if they call me after the fact and say, we're not really comfortable with that airing, I respect that because they've opened up to me. But in 2009, my friend and colleague was a victim of domestic violence, and none of us knew that she was going through this. She was going through a divorce, and that divorce was supposed to be finalized the next day after her death. And she was home, and she started texting a colleague of ours at the TV station to call 911 for her. because she did not want to be heard. She was hiding in a closet. And coming to work the next day, I found out, my producer called me and told me, and then I came into work. And, sometimes if a loved one dies, your grandmother, your mom, something like that, that one person will take time off from the TV station, but this was all of us. So we all could not call out. So we were all there on air reporting it. We knew who it was before we gave the name on the air. And that was the hardest thing I've ever had to do as a journalist, was anchor and cover your friend's death and murder. I remember my news director came up to me and said, this was back in 2009. So we just didn't have like the digital footprint that we do now. But he said, the only picture we can find right now of Alice is one of you and Alice, and it was in her desk. Can we show that on the air? And I said, sure. And as soon as that picture popped up on the air, I just lost it on TV. My co-anchor, thankfully he was there and kept it together better than I did. But yeah, I was, always felt like I could keep my emotions in check, but this was just a totally different situation. And even in the days and weeks and months that followed, it was really hard to do interviews for me. Like I remember our station really tried to raise awareness on domestic violence, which is the amazing thing about journalism. You have such a platform to make change, to raise awareness. And so we focused on domestic violence, and we had these women come in that worked at a local domestic violence shelter. And I was supposed to do the interview, and they were talking about signs. And then I just kept thinking of all the things that I missed, especially with domestic violence. Before I thought maybe it was someone was coming in with bruises on their arms and it was just obvious. And no, now I've learned domestic violence can be little subtle controlling signs, always calling, who are you with? Stuff like that. And I work a lot now with teen dating violence. And it's so important for teenagers to know these signs as well, what's okay and what's not. But I started crying. I couldn't do the interview. My co-anchor had to go do the interview. And the women invited me to the shelter, and I started working with them in Connecticut. And I continued to work with different domestic violence organizations, where whatever market I'm in. But I really learned in that situation to turn your pain into your purpose. A lot of times the things that hurt us the most are how we can help other people. And I find that in people that I interview, people sometimes say, oh my gosh, if I was in that situation, I would never sit down with a reporter, or if they called me, I wouldn't want to talk to them. But a lot of the times you're honoring their loved one's life, A, and then B, you're raising awareness and bringing about change, whether it's breast cancer awareness, suicide prevention, domestic violence. And so that situation, as tough as it was, really changed me as a journalist. And I'm still really close to Alice's brother. He does a lot of speaking engagements as well. And I think that helps him with his healing process too.
Yeah, I love that. Turn your pain into your purpose. And you're doing exactly that, which is so admirable and so resilient on your end.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, Sarah, during that time, you mentioned that you always try to keep your emotions in check. And as journalists, especially being in broadcast and television, we are expected to keep our emotions contained on air when we are covering difficult situations. How was that for you? And how did you cope with those emotions in the aftermath of this? Like, what were some tools that helped you, aside from eventually going into these nonprofit organizations and helping bring awareness with domestic violence? Like, what did you do for yourself during that time?
Yeah, it was really hard for me because I'm known as like the smiley, bubbly person. It's how everybody knows me. And so for me, it just felt fake, to get up on the news for months to follow and just be that smiley, bubbly person. But viewers knew what we were going through. They almost went through it with us, and that's why I'm always about being honest and open with our lives, because viewers do feel like you're a part of their family in a way. For me now, I know we'll get into the Boston Marathon bombing in a little bit, but for me, it was hard for a long time to figure out what helped. And I know we talked about this on the phone, but for me, becoming a part of a church family that I always had people there for me was huge for me. Also, I'm big on therapy. Like, you don't need it all the time, but sometimes you need it. And there is nothing wrong with therapy or taking medicine if you need it. I'm all about, it's so individualized. And that's what I realized in my grad school research too. I mean, you can say TV stations should do this, or this is what journalists need, but each person's going to need something different. So being able to have those resources for journalists is so vital. And for a period of time, the company I'm with had like 3 counseling sessions per year. And then last year they changed it to 12, which some journalists, even in the grad school research that I did, said, gosh, we wish we at least had a free counseling session once a month, just to talk out what we've seen, what we've covered. And so I think that's so important. And the hard thing about the pandemic is in newsrooms are almost like therapy. You're talking it out, you're talking about stories or what you covered or how your interview went. When I was a reporter, in Boston, we'd be sent 2 hours away, and then I could be in the car with my Photog talking about what we saw, kind of hashing it out. Well, that's kind of like therapy in a sense. And in a way, sometimes that's just what people need, to talk it out, to have someone who understands what they're going through, who've been through a similar situation. But yeah, there are certain scenarios where people do need professional help, and you should not be ashamed or afraid to see someone and say, hey, I'm struggling.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's 100% valid to say, hey, I'm struggling. I need help, and seek help.
Yeah.
Because we do a very difficult job. That leads me then to the Boston bombings. And I know you were on the ground covering it extensively. And I believe from what you've told me over the phone that you've also made it a mission to turn this very painful situation and your reporting on it into part of your purpose. Do you want to go into that and how that was for you?
Yeah, so that was really just a scary situation. I was heading down to the scene right after the first bomb went off, not knowing if more bombs were going to go off. Ultimately, only 2 went off. But still, we didn't know that in the middle of it. And so I was calling my family, my boyfriend at the time, who's my husband now. And I felt like I was giving my final goodbye calls because I just didn't know what was going to happen. And I truly felt like I was not prepared. I just kept saying, I'm not trained to be a war correspondent. Like, what's happening to our city? It was really scary. And so from that situation, when I was in Boston, so many things happened. I mean, we had, there was like Whitey Bulger, and there's Boston Marathon bombing. There was Sandy Hook, which was, close enough to us. And I had just been in Connecticut. There was Aaron Hernandez. There was Tom Brady Deflategate. So there was always something. So there was no time to sit back and talk about what you had covered. It was always just on to the next. And so people weren't processing, and the Boston Marathon being probably the hardest thing, they weren't processing what they had seen or, witnessed or just from interviewing someone, you can experience secondary trauma. So that's what I learned in my research as well. And so sometimes I think journalists feel like, well, I didn't go through this. They went through it. I shouldn't feel like this. But just from sitting down with them and interviewing them, we learned this from parents who covered Sandy Hook. I mean, they had children and they could almost put themselves in their shoes. And so journalists said the hardest thing to cover was the death of a child. So even if you weren't like on the scene of the Boston Marathon bombing, you can still experience trauma and still need to seek help. But yeah, that was a really difficult story to cover. And then in the weeks and months that followed, you know, we never had a conversation at the station about what had happened. As far as I recall, and I've talked to other colleagues and friends too, I don't remember like an email going out like, here are your resources. But again, I mean, the more you talk to people in journalism, this just wasn't something that was talked about. It wasn't until, you know, I started grad school literally right before the pandemic. It took me 2 years to graduate. But so then you went through the pandemic and people are being sent home from work, schools are closing, there's protests, there's the election. And so I think now more than ever, people have a heightened sense of like how important mental health is and talking about it. But even during the Boston Marathon bombing, it just, at the time, people just weren't talking about it. And so my friend and photographer that I worked with on the day of the Boston Marathon bombing, about a year after the bombing, he decided to take his own life. And I talked to his wife. She's part of my grad school research as well. And she said, you know, he was embarrassed. He was embarrassed to talk about what he was struggling with. And, you know, she doesn't blame news entirely. But if you're struggling, what we do and what we see and the scenes that we're sent out on and the people we're asked to interview, like that can be traumatic and that can almost make things worse in a way. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't be in journalism. That can mean you're perfect for this job. Like sometimes if you've been through an experience, you can sit down with someone else and be the best person to interview that person, the best person to share that story in the way it needs to be told. But after he died, and especially I didn't get in, I had my own struggles after the bombing. I thought, I'm getting out of the business. Like, this is not meant for me. I remember they had a meeting for all the like victims and their family members and money that they would receive. But it was open. So all the journalists were sent there. And I saw a woman whose husband was in the hospital, lost a limb. And so I was talking to her and I was going to ask her, you know, would you like to talk on camera? But she was sharing some stuff with me that she didn't want on camera. Mm-hmm. And in that split second, it was like a swarm of news reporters with microphones came, and she was so taken aback and she started crying and left. And I just thought that this is not for me. This is not, I can't do this anymore. And so I really thought about getting out. I had professors from the University of Missouri ask me to speak to their class right after the bombing. I could not do it. I was literally I wanted to crawl into a hole. And so that was pretty much like my first experience with therapy. And I tried to go talk to someone and we just didn't click, which now I've realized, which it's hard. If people put themselves out there, they don't want to keep trying to find the right therapist or counselor or doctor. And so you've got to like be brave and be able to do that. Of course, now there's so many options like Talkspace or BetterHelp, where you can download apps and literally text your therapist if that's all you want to do, or you can switch them that way, or you can do virtual calls. So there's so many different options that weren't there just a few years ago. But I came across this quote. I wanted to read it to you.
Yeah, please.
If I can find it.
Because
I came across this quote, and this is what really I felt like got me through during the marathon bombing, because I thought, I don't want to knock on people's doors. I don't want to do this anymore. And then I came across this quote by John Geiger, and it says, "There is a purpose for everyone you meet. Some people will test you, some will bring out the best in you, but everyone will teach you something about yourself. Both positive and negative relationships teach you valuable lessons. No relationship is a waste of time. The wrong ones teach you the lessons that prepare you for the right ones. Appreciate everyone that enters your life because they are contributing to your growth." And so I really started just every door knock, every story I was sent on, I thought, okay, there's a purpose and a reason for this. I'm either going to help them or teach them something, or they're going to teach me something. And for a lot of the times when I interview people, like, they are teaching me such amazing life lessons when I sit down with them. And so I really had that mindset going forward, and that really, really helped me overcome some of the struggles that I was going through. But yeah, I got that in the back of my mind after my photographer's name was Neil, after Neil died, that more needs to be done to help journalists. We aren't talking about the struggles journalists are going through. Yeah. And so it wasn't until my baby brother graduated from medical school and I went back to his graduation. And I don't know, when you're like, now people look at me and say, "Sarah, you're crazy." But when I was like back on campus, I was just like, this is amazing. Like, don't you just love school? Like, I want to go back to school. And then I got in the middle of it, and working with 2 kids, I thought, what am I doing? This was not a good decision. But, but no, once I got into my research, I told my committee chair, I said, this is like, it's never ending. Like, every person I talk to recommends me to talk to somebody else, and I get more information and more stories. And I feel like I could just go on forever with this research, but eventually I needed to stop and write my paper, which he said was the longest paper he ever had at 309 pages. But yeah, I feel very passionate about more can always be done to help journalists. And I with every job, there's pros and cons, obviously, but I do feel, like I said earlier, we have an amazing platform. And so that's why I am passionate about journalism and storytelling. But, you know, more needs to be done to help those that are telling those stories.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that quote. And I think I resonate with it so much too.
Yeah.
We have so much to learn. I mean, I'm learning so much from just hearing your own personal experiences right now. And the fact that you've turned all this very personal pain into your mission as well is just amazing. And the research that you're doing right now and what you've been able to find speaking to different journalists. Do you want to share a little bit about, some of the percentages that you shared with me?
Yeah. So I pulled that up here to read to you. So I had like over 100 journalists that were interviewed. 60% remained anonymous though, but yeah. Just to read some of these statistics to you, 90% said not enough emphasis is put on mental health for journalists. 82% said they've received no prior training to cover traumatic events. 90% said they received no prior training in college to cover traumatic events. 83% said they never received any training from their TV station to cover traumatic events. 58% said after covering a traumatic event, station management never checked in on them. 62% said after covering a traumatic event, nothing beneficial was done by their station to help with their mental health. 66% said they never sought counseling after covering a traumatic event, and 58% said they feel like something bad is always going to happen. So those are some pretty striking numbers when you look at it as a whole. But what I realized in that research, some of the interviews I did on Zoom, and I would encourage anyone listening to watch that video. I have a video on my YouTube page or my website, sarahsfrench.com. But
What a beautiful video.
it, yeah, so the few journalists that went on camera with me, I put together this little video just about the struggles that they've gone through. And it's really powerful when you see it together. And one of my friends and photographers here in Charlotte, he helped me edit that, and he did such an incredible job. And Al Tompkins of Pointer, who I interviewed a lot in my research, asked if he could use it at some of his conferences and stuff. So, the people that open up, they're just continuing to help other people. But what I realized in some of those anonymous responses that I did receive, a lot of people were saying the same thing, and they all feel like they're just alone on this island, that I'm the only one that's not a strong journalist and can't handle it. When a lot of people, and I would look at these answers, and some of them would be, older men who've been in the business, 37 years, or photographers who have been in the news business for years that are struggling with this, but don't talk about it. And if you don't talk about it, then you think you're alone. Talking gives you freedom, and it's always going to help someone else who thinks they're the only one struggling.
For sure. And it's funny because what's coming up for me right now is the movie Encanto. Have you seen it?
Yes, my kids love it. The songs are stuck in my head. Like, I can't stop singing them. And everyone in the newsroom looks at me like, what are you singing, Sarah?
I mean, well, if you have kids, you got to sing it. I have a niece and nephew, so I'm singing it with them all the time. But what's coming up is the song We Don't Talk About Bruno, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like our Bruno in news stations is mental health and the struggles we're facing. And speaking about mental health, covering traumatic events, speaking about the traumatic events after we cover them is what we need to do to be able to move on to the next news story.
Yeah. And even the sister in Encanto, who's supposed to be the strong one, and she has so much pressure, but she doesn't want to break. She doesn't want to let anyone down. And so if you don't talk about it, stuff will pile up until you break. And that's what I realized with grad school. Like, I wrote my essay to get in all about covering the Boston Marathon bombing and about my friend Neil. And then as I started doing my research, I realized, oh, wait, like, I've been dealing with trauma stuff in news since Alice died, and I never sought help. I mean, my storytelling and, like I said, turning pain into purpose is almost like therapy for me. It's therapeutic in a way. But I thought, so I dealt with Alice, and then on top of every, car crash scene, murder scene, all that stuff you go to and never dealing with it. And then the Boston Marathon happened, and then it was like the straw that broke the camel's back for me, because I kept piling on all those stories and taking them home with me, and not treating the trauma in a sense that all those stories, can do to you as a journalist.
Yeah. And I think your Photog is an unfortunate and really, really sad example of that, because the main character in Encanto, she, trying to be strong or whatever, not expressing emotions, not talking about it, eventually that leads you to break. And unfortunately, he broke so much that he took his own life and thought that that was the only option out. And it's crazy that, we're bringing this up now, because just the other day I was interviewing a colleague too, who expressed to me on camera that he considered taking his own life at one point, and I told him, I'm so happy you chose to live. And but that's not always the case, and we need to do a better job to make sure that we are addressing these concerns and situations and strong emotions, because there is no reason why anyone in the news industry or any industry alone should feel embarrassed to talk about the pain and suffering that they're going through to help process these emotions.
Yeah, I mean, if you're having heart problems, you take heart medication. If you're diabetic, you take insulin. So if you're having mental health issues, like, go get treatment. It is like your mental health is just as important, if not more important, than your physical health. And so I think we're slowly chipping away and getting there in our society and newsroom cultures. But it's definitely something that I think some people see as a waste of time and resources, and they just want you to suck it up and keep going. But everyone has to pay attention to it. And my research really focused on people that have been in the business or, worked in the business and then left. I didn't interview college kids, and it did seem like the younger people, like in their 20s that I was interviewing, had some sort of class, or they had some guest speakers in their class. So I think they are talking about it more, which makes me happy, because they're, of course, the future of journalism, future news directors and GMs and producers and reporters. And I told you the other day, I spoke to a class in Hartford, a journalism college course that one of my former colleagues from Hartford that worked with Alice, he's teaching now, and he asked me to come speak. So I was really glad that he was working on that as well. But speaking of classes, in my research, I interviewed a woman by the name of Catherine Reed. She was a professor at Mizzou. She's not there anymore, but during her time at Mizzou, she had a class that she taught solely dedicated to covering trauma. And she said the only other professor in the entire country was a man named Ari Goldman. He developed a class solely related to trauma at Columbia University. But as far as she knew, at her time at Mizzou, they were the only two professors in the entire country that had a class in journalism that was solely dedicated to covering trauma, which is so important. Not only covering trauma for, like, how do you take care of yourself as a journalist, but also how do you interview other people who have just gone through such traumatic experiences. So I think really in journalism now, if you want to get a degree in journalism, I wholeheartedly believe there should be a class dedicated to covering trauma and interviewing victims of trauma. It's so important.
For sure. Because just the example that you gave when you were speaking to this woman by yourself, where she felt like she was in a safe space to speak directly to you and not to a camera.
Yeah.
Having reporters barge in and kind of dismiss those boundaries, or just not give it importance, to ask for permission before starting to record a conversation, caused this whole reaction in her. And yeah, we definitely need to be better trained to cover these elements.
And not every journalist would do this, but I interviewed this family a couple of years ago. Here is exclusive interview. I interviewed the mom and the brother. So his brother, her son, was a police officer that was killed at a traffic stop. And so I sat down with the family and did this entire interview with them. There was also like some safety concerns with his equipment and stuff. So it wasn't just on his death. But after I did the interview, they called me up and said, we had talked about that moment that they found out that he had died. And they called me up, they said, we don't really want that moment out there. Can you not use it? And I chose not to use it because I feel, and this has worked for me,
Yeah.
I've done a lot of exclusive interviews with families who have lost loved ones. It gets around how you conduct interviews, and also people can see how you share their story. So I know every journalist wants the exclusive interview, but respecting that person that you're interviewing, especially someone who's gone through such trauma, you will build a resume of stories that people see that they can trust to tell their story to you. And so for me, that has worked more so than worrying about getting every detail or even an exclusive on TV. And so then people, I think that then they trust you, and then they come to you to share their story.
For sure. Yeah, and because we, at the end of the day, we are humans first. And if you show that respect and
Yes.
honor that
Yeah.
space, that shows,
Yeah.
um, for sure. Sarah, from all your experiences and everything you've covered, what do you think so far has been one of the most rewarding situations you've had in journalism?
Um, Probably two things that come to mind. One was when I was in Hartford, I started Make-A-Wish Mondays, where I got to highlight Make-A-Wish kids.
Mhm.
So that was just incredible for me. Like I said, sometimes when you interview people and families, they really put life in perspective, and you leave going, oh my goodness, like the things I was worried about, like, no, and so just being able to tell the story of these kids for Make-A-Wish Mondays. And then that series actually ended up being my first Emmy win. And so that was just, I loved telling those stories more than anything. The
Yeah, and your
second
face
one,
lights up as you're speaking about it. I
yeah.
love
Well,
that.
anything with kids, I have a heart for kids. I know my mom was a kindergarten teacher, and I even said this morning, like, I would have loved to have been a teacher.
Yeah.
I just love working with kids. And I volunteer on Sundays in my daughter's Sunday school class. So I get it sort of like
Okay.
that way. I fill that void a little bit, but
Yeah.
I love, like when we do appearances, sometimes people, I'm getting off track, but
No,
sometimes
you're fine. Please go on. You're lighting up talking about this.
um, sometimes people in news, they love going to the fancy dinners and the big MC galas and stuff. My favorite is just going to schools and doing readings to kids, like reading a
Yeah.
book and visiting, because their face lights up and they're so
Yeah.
excited to see you, and they're just like, they're so funny. They're like, can we feel your hair? Oh, it's hard. I'm like, yep, I got that anchor hair going. I mean, they say the funniest things, and they're just, I love working with kids. And now I forgot where we were going.
Yeah, I love that. It's
Oh, the
genuine.
stories.
No, but I completely understand where you're coming from, because I think my favorite part is going to schools as well and speaking to kids, or just giving inspirational, motivational talks.
Yeah.
So I understand you completely.
So fun.
Um,
Yeah, it brings joy. But
yeah.
the second one I think of is probably my trip to Haiti. I went to Haiti
Okay.
after the earthquake, a year after the earthquake. And so that story, there was a girl who was a reporter in Hartford, and she was there volunteering during the massive 2010 earthquake.
Okay.
And she ended up changing careers and became a nurse.
Wow.
So we had her on our show. We were interviewing her, and I was like, this is amazing. And she takes these groups of nurses now back to Haiti to do like clinics, to treat people. She stays at an orphanage. And I was like, I've got to go. Like, this is amazing. So I went into my boss's office and I was like, I have a great idea. Like, I'm going to go with them to Haiti. I'm going to tell these stories. And she was like, yeah, no, you're not going to do that. And so I never liked taking no as an answer. My mother, it was like a lot of trouble for her with me growing up, but then it's worked out with my career. And so I always tell journalists, it's not always no, but it's sometimes finding a different way. Yeah. And so I went in and I said, okay, if I use my vacation time and pay for my flight, will you air the stories? She was like, yeah, I guess. And the crazy thing about it, which I just, sometimes the way life works, it's just amazing. But we had a young editor. They weren't even letting him go out and shoot stuff yet. He was just editing. He was asked by his church group. So this church group was actually traveling with the nurses, which I didn't even realize.
Okay.
And they asked him to go to film some stuff for their website. So he was going to be there on the same trip, the same time as me. So thank goodness, because I'm not the best photographer. Yeah. I didn't have to use my little camera that I was going to bring, and he shot everything. And we ended up winning an Emmy for that series, Hope for Haiti, as well. But we stayed at an orphanage there. And while it was so eye-opening to go on that trip and see like the hospital situation there, we slept in a hammock outside for a week. We stayed at that orphanage. And I remember one of the little kids, his name was Ulrich. I bet he was like 2, maybe younger when I was there, but I walked outside with him and he was picking up trash and holding it like it was his toy, because it was the only thing he could find, that would be his.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was such an eye-opening experience. And I remember coming back to the States and being like going to a restaurant or going to a pool or going to a toy store and being like, oh my goodness, if those kids could just see this, like, oh, they would be amazed. Oh, they'd love to swim in this pool, or, And so for me, being able to tell their stories and what this local group of nurses, what they were doing in Haiti, but also, again, how it was just life-changing for me. Like, that's an experience of a lifetime that I'll never forget.
Yeah, and so eye-opening. And it just shows your passion too. When we're so passionate about our career, we do crazy stuff to like offering to use our vacation because we want to tell the story so badly, and we strongly believe in that story.
People thought I was crazy. And actually, when I went down there, I got 2 of my friends to go to. I was like, I'm going on this trip. You guys should come. One of them was a nurse, and so she came. But the other one was in journalism. Okay. And she switched after that trip too. And now she's a physician's assistant in Kansas City. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So, that trip really, really was life-changing. But I was like, props to you for, I went back and got my master's, which was normally supposed to be like a 1-year program, but because I just did it at each class at a time, it took 2 years. But I always tell her all the time, like, you 180'd. And so I always love telling those stories, because sometimes, people do think I want to switch careers, and that's okay. Yeah. But they think it's too late, and it's never too late.
It's never too late.
You can do it. Her name's Sarah too, so I always use Sarah as my inspiration to tell people you can always change careers if you want to put your mind to it.
Yeah. Now I have to ask you, are you sure you don't want to be a nurse?
Yeah. No, I am not good with blood, not needles. Every time I get a shot or they take my blood, I always look this way and they'll say, "Are you okay?" I'm like, I promise I won't pass out. I just can't look at it. You can't look at it.
That's hilarious. I'm the same way. I literally feel like a baby because I have to turn to the side. I'm like, I can't see you putting it in.
Yeah. We'll leave that. My brother's a doctor, so I'll leave him to that and to take care of all that stuff.
Oh my goodness, Sarah, this has been such an amazing conversation. The only thing I have left to ask you, unless you have anything else to add, is, something you'd like to see improved in the news industry, or what we can do to make it better.
Again, just more resources for journalists. In that research that I did, I asked journalists what their wish list would be if they could have anything that their TV station would provide. I'm gonna read some of them to you because I have them pulled up here.
Please do.
These are just a few of them, but they said mental health training, on-site counselors, a 24/7 helpline, a small group, team support groups, training by someone who understands the news business, open and regular communication about the importance of mental health and services available, at least 12 counseling sessions per year, which I was telling you about.
Yeah.
Easier to find mental health providers that are covered under insurance, counselor match, more time off or flexible hours, or mental health days, no questions asked. And just to wrap this up, I interviewed a woman that worked for the ABC in Australia. She's retired now, but she started a program there where there was a 24/7 helpline from journalists all over the country. And you could call and talk to someone who had been through a similar experience that you have in covering the story. And for the most part, that helped. That was all the journalists needed. They were trained like to spot the red flags if, yes, this person should talk to a professional. But for the most part, they were just suffering from, seeing something traumatic and needed to talk it out with someone. That program is still implemented at the ABC in Australia today, and the BBC just picked it up to do something like that. But she told me there's nothing like that here in the United States for journalists. I know the network level, they have more resources than local journalists, but it's so important. Local news is not what it once was. And there should be resources, training, and I could go on and on about it, but it falls on, managers, and it falls on the assignment desk, producers, and then reporters not being afraid to speak up. We're all responsible in the newsroom to look out for each other, to look out for ourselves. But it starts with speaking up and just being cognizant of that and not wanting to run your people into the ground,
For sure. I think we have to advocate for ourselves 100%. Because if we don't do it, we're not creating this community of support. And if we are covering these kinds of events daily and being forced to move on to the next news stories and not giving ourselves time to process the traumatic events that we're covering, God forbid, it'll lead us to situations where we're making terrible decisions, thinking that there's no way out of this, and there is.
And not every manager is going to understand, but if you don't speak up, they're never going to know that there's a problem, that you're struggling. And so, like I said, speaking up is your first step. And I promise you, there will be someone that will be there for you that understands what it's like to go through that. And maybe with you just speaking up, you're going to help that other person in the newsroom who thinks they're all alone.
Exactly. I agree 100%. I couldn't have said it better. Sarah, thank you so much. It has been such an honor to have you on Media Healers.
My gosh, anytime. I love what you're doing. And I should add here that before we even met, with my grad school research, I put on my website information, resources, links that people can utilize, that journalists can utilize. And I have a whole podcast section, and I put your podcast, I found your podcast in my research. So I put it there as a resource. So after I graduated, when you reached out to me, I thought, oh my goodness, I know who this is.
That's so beautiful. When you told me that, I was so honored. I was like, I can't believe you found my podcast. And this is so amazing, because this, at the end of the day, part of the intention with Media Healers is this precisely, creating community so we can help each other. And I'm so honored that I'm part of your research resource.
What you're doing is great, and you're helping so many people with your podcast as well, I know.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks for being with us here today as well.
Thanks for having me.
Journalists, this one's for you, to help you heal, to help you understand your worth, and to help you know you're not alone. So share the love and subscribe to Spotify and YouTube, and follow us on Instagram. The Awakened Journalist is proud to present Media Healers by Emiliana Molina Fajardo.